Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the very many news items we have for you this week, evidence of human evolution that's been occurring very recently and we can observe it ourselves. Man's infection could well lead to a way to break down plastic, assuming that the microbes can be cultured and used. An anti-aging cocktail used to extend mouse lifespan, which may not be particularly useful if the little buggers live longer. A gene-edited spider produces incredibly bright red silk. A hawk in New Jersey has found a new hunting strategy, compensating and essentially making up for the fact they live in a suburban environment by taking advantage of traffic lights. The UK has had to issue warnings through various retailers that strawberries may be particularly large this season. A study claiming that only one country in the world could theoretically supply all of its own food needs if suddenly it was cut off from every other country. A question about what happens to your digital remains after you die. Problems around just how much research is being produced and what appear to be not just formulaic but possibly very much intentional. And finally, evidence of the Martian atmosphere sputtering for what it's worth. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with evidence of human evolution that's very recent, and we're talking actual recent here. Admittedly, it's a 10,000 year period, so we're not going to say that this is something you could do yourself. But by looking at fossilized and archaeological remains in Tibet, and specifically the Tibetan plateau, we can look at what happens when oxygen levels in the air go down, a direct consequence of living up in the Himalayas. And the results themselves are a direct result of Chinese researchers basically grave robbing Tibetan remains. The crux of this research is that when you live up high in altitude terms, you end up with a reduction in oxygen available in the air. It's just not there because the pressure is lower. This means your body needs to find a way to compensate. Typically speaking, this is going to go one of two ways. In the short term, you basically have suffocation and possibly hypoxia and then death. In the longer term, for those who survive, they find ways to, say for example, increase red blood cell production, thereby delivering more of that very limited oxygen around your body more effectively. And it's this latter instance that's so very useful here because it's exactly what's been observed. Admittedly, the findings are very much based on individual women and the fact that they appear to be able to carry a child to complete term and therefore give birth. But nonetheless, it is a very clear-cut demonstration of not just fitness, but natural selection. The researchers themselves weren't actually grave robbing. Instead, the researchers found about 400 women between the ages of 46 and 86 in Nepal. And note that Nepal has a very large Tibetan population, essentially people who have, for all intents and purposes, immigrated as refugees to Nepal, given how Tibetans are persecuted by the Chinese authorities. What they found is that there is a notable difference based on the altitude of where they are and the number of live births. Now, the number of live births here is rather important because it ranges between 0 and 14. The 14 being an extreme outlier, as the average is about 5.2. The other notable effect here is that hemoglobin, or basically the functional part of the red blood cell, appeared to be higher in those that had a higher success rate in having children. So this is basically proof of what we know to some extent regarding living in higher altitudes and ability to survive. What may or may not contribute to human evolution and survival is, well, males doing dumb shit. And this is not new. Males basically have a lower survival rate than females because they do something stupid. But this time it's particularly dumb. It's testing the idea that testicles have taste receptors, and yes, they do, but you don't need to go dipping them into various sources to figure this out. In fact, it's kinda silly to do so. But the older article, let's call it, is still evidence of why humanity may well be doomed. Or why suddenly sauce sales skyrocketed for certain flavors, as people found that, well, males found, that their testicles may prefer particular flavors. In things that are going to possibly contribute to success of humanity, we have the ability to break down plastic, but specifically plastic in hospitals, after a man was wounded and essentially infected by bacteria. It's notable that hospital plastic is particularly difficult to dispose of. Generally speaking, it basically has to be incinerated in particular ways to avoid all sorts of issues with the biological hazard or chemical hazard. But if we can break it down using bacteria, this is arguably much more environmentally friendly. Consider that we no longer really go into a hospital and have a tray of, say, stainless steel tools that get reused. In almost every instance, something being used in a hospital is a single-use item. There is never any reuse of anything if it can be avoided. This is partly to avoid issues around infection, but more generally because it's cheaper. And at least in the case of America, the hospital can charge you an extra kidney to pay for your fees. What's useful here is that these bacteria could address both of these problems. The first being obviously the fact that we're not reusing anything, but the second that we are producing considerable amounts of waste and waste products from incinerating the various plastic products used within hospitals. The Aeruginosa species is one species that's already known to be able to produce biofilms. Biofilm-producing species are also well known to be able to break down plastics more effectively than other species can. And so this brings us to an individual who essentially had this particular bacteria in his wound. It was cultured and it was found that actually this works fairly damn well for a lot of different things, including the breakdown of hospital-based plastics. This is a very slim benefit to one man being infected with a pathogenic form of bacteria. Next is claims of a link between the use of menthol and Alzheimer's disease, although be aware that this is entirely based on a rodent model and therefore may or may not have any application to humans because you can't really translate research that reliably. It isn't a nice place to start, but starting somewhere and actually getting to the conclusion can be a very long trip in between. The researchers involved in this have basically found that interleukin-1 beta, which is a protein that helps regulate the body's inflammatory response, appears to be, let's say, interfered with by the use of menthol-containing products, whether this is something like, say, chest rub or cigarettes in many cases. And so, by looking at the role of the olfactory system in particular, that is basically your nose and ability to smell, they established that, yes, there is a certain amount of, not necessarily risk, but a concern from short exposure to menthol over 6 months, and how this can then lead to an increase in Alzheimer's. It is, as we said, somewhat questionable, but it's not to say that it's entirely wrong to say that they might have something. It's just very preliminary and arguably somewhat questionable. The exact mechanism the researchers think is coming into play here is that by interfering with the olfactory system, essentially being able to smell menthol, you're then changing the number of T regulatory cells. These are what, to a certain extent, unsurprisingly, regulate the immune system, and this then had an effect on the interleukin-1 beta that was within the brain, and that then has an effect on cognitive decline. There are several steps here that we aren't entirely clear have necessarily been established definitively, and of course definitely not in humans, but it is at least somewhere to start. In other rodent news, we have extending the lifespan of either your lab rat or that painful mouse in your house that always manages to outsmart you and escapes every trap you lay. And it can live that much longer, up to 30% longer, with a degree of surety depending on which particular cocktail of drugs you're giving it. This is, if it works in humans, arguably going to be very useful because, well, depending on how you look at this, you might live longer.
It tastes familiar.
Beef?
No.
Chicken? We'll take chicken.
What does it taste like?
Despair?
For some people, living longer might actually be an extended time in hell, but for most people they seem to think the idea of living longer is better. 2 drugs are used, rapamycin and tremelimumab. These are typically used to treat cancer and to avoid organ rejection. So by working with these 2 drugs, somehow it extends the lifespan of both a lot of rodents and also fruit flies. Now, obviously, humans are neither of these and as such How well it will translate is somewhat questionable. The other benefit here is that individually, either of these drugs can increase the lifespan of the mice involved by roughly 15%, give or take a little bit. When you use them together, the improvement's somewhere between 26 and 35%, so your 30% improvement's something of an average. In some kind of theoretical answer, we could explain away the observed benefits simply because the rodents that were given this treatment had a reduced body weight. Basically, they weren't fat. They were slower in terms of their heart function decline, and they seemed to be more physically active. That is, they basically got the trifecta of things that would generally avoid you having, say, a heart attack, a stroke, or something similar that would lead to your untimely death, or more accurately, timely death. And this is probably why, theoretically, that's why the rodents live longer. But it's very, very unlikely that humans will live to, say, 110 or even up to 130.
I don't want to live on this planet anymore.
If they follow this particular regime of treatment, it's simply because there are other factors that contribute extensively to human mortality that much earlier. For example, dipping your testicles in various sauces to see if you can taste them through your testicles. In other possible ways you might die, there has been a case of sudden death amongst bodybuilders, professional bodybuilders, that has raised certain concerns about what's going on. We are talking here about a largely observational study, so causation's not going to be established, but you can, to a certain extent, establish correlation. There have been about 24 individuals who've died in every 12-month period in terms of the bodybuilding world. Now, these are not amazing numbers, simply because, to some extent, 24 people dying in a given year is basically nothing, except for the age and the specificity of who they are, the youngest of these being about 25 or so. So naturally, with a very young age at the starting point, and obviously getting older, the very specific context of being bodybuilders and everything else, it raises a question. Is it safe? And if it's not safe, what might be causing it? The study does have a fairly solid basis to it. It followed about 20,000 bodybuilders over a period of 8 years. Over that 8-year period, about 73 of the individuals died, and they died at an average age of about 42, but not so important yet. What is more important is that you can start excluding some of these deaths. For example, use of steroids and similar drugs to improve performance. And of course there are other variables such as suicide, vehicle accidents, and otherwise dying from something otherwise unrelated to their biological or physiological functions as bodybuilders. When they compare this to the amateur bodybuilder group, basically anybody who just goes to the gym and tries to destroy the world through global warming, we have a 14-fold increase at the end of the study. It's notable that at the earliest time point there is almost no difference whatsoever, which does indicate that there is more going on here with regards to dose response, rather than the actual act of bodybuilding itself or activity. What's important here is that there is a notable distinction, and they do believe there may be some explanation. The concerns they've raised are regarding the extreme training regimes that are used, the strict dietary practices that are followed, and, to be blunt about it, the use of things like steroids and similar, that raise the risk of heart attack or other similar cardiac events, notably amongst professionals, at least compared to the amateur group. There's also some question about actual damage to the heart, particularly hypertrophy, amongst the autopsied individuals. But this is a very, very specific and narrow subset of all those who are involved in the study and the data that's available. In slightly more terrifying news, depending on how you want to look at this, we have genetically edited spiders. Fortunately, not genetically edited to be more sneaky and dangerous. Instead, they might be more obvious, because now their web will be fluorescent red. The research is probably not a great deal of use as it is right now, but in theory, it could be useful in producing various products, notably things like, say, protective wear, where you no longer need to dye it, it comes out exactly the color you want. Those people working and wearing safety vests no longer need to worry about getting it that particularly bright colour. It already arrives that way. There are, of course, a wide swath of other possible applications given the strength in tensile terms and the simple wear resistance that spider silk has by comparison to a lot of artificial and even natural fibres, or other natural fibres, given that spiders are, unfortunately, a natural part of nature and therefore their theoretical silk production, well, in this case, very much real silk production, is natural. This might be the next particularly in vogue house decorating approach. Get yourself some genetically engineered spiders and have them lay up cobwebs everywhere that are the colour of your choice. In arguably even more bizarre news, although this time it's entirely Australian, so be prepared, we have echidnas and the fact that researchers have been exploring their mammalian pouch. Echidnas are bizarre. Strictly speaking, they're not mammals. They are instead in a weird, let's say, category, where they not only lay eggs, but they have milk production, which essentially means they're between a bird and a mammal, but they also have various other things, like, for example, marsupial pouches. None of this seems right, which is why Australia's got the most messed up animals of any place in the world. But understanding what's going on in these weird pseudo-pouches is possibly useful in understanding what's going on in Australia, if anybody could ever figure it out eventually, but also more useful in understanding how to, say, conserve echidnas, which, depending on which part of the world they are, may at least be somewhat endangered. To understand just how weird the echidna is, we need to look at what goes on when they give birth. First of all, they give birth to a single egg. This egg contains, obviously, it's called a puggle, but a pup within it. This egg is carried around in the pouch, or pseudo-pouch, for about 10 days, after which the small puggle is born, and after that it eventually starts growing up. But within that pouch there's also a small area that the pup can rub itself against, and it will produce milk, in a very similar way to, say, a sweat gland producing sweat. And this is why the echidna is really weird. The echidna baby will stay within that pouch, or pseudo-pouch, for about a month, sometimes more, sometimes less, allowing it to grow much bigger, and eventually the mother will literally just kick it out because carrying around a baby on you all the time, and in this case in you, is not cool. To better understand what's going on here, we need to look at why it is that they're doing this, and a part of it is, quite literally, they wanted to understand how, without having a vaginal delivery of any kind of sort, the baby echidna gets its necessary bacterial and similar pathogens exposure to develop a strong working immune system. And they did this by rather invasively finding themselves 22 echidnas and swabbing their pseudo-pouch at different times of the reproductive cycle to figure out what's going on. The answers are fairly straightforward in some ways. That is, at different times of the reproductive cycle, different bacteria become dominant. So, for example, you have certain species of bacteria more dominant when they're lactating, and far less dominant when there are other times, such as during birth. In news that's somewhat more entertaining, an American hawk has figured out how to deal with the fact that people live in urban environments, but urban environments also make for excellent hunting grounds by using traffic lights. The New Jersey hawk has basically been taking advantage of the fact that there are certain behaviors within animals that it can use. What happens is that during the morning, various children, for the most part, and thankfully they're not the prey, will stop at traffic lights on their way to school. It will then hover around, waiting for this traffic light to go red, and then provide an opportunity for it to dive into one of the various possibilities. For example, finding animals or food between cars that have stopped. More often though, the hawk is not looking to, let's say, find that sort of food. Instead, it's looking at this environment where other birds are trying to take advantage of that phenomena. Trash that's been abandoned on the side of the road, including uneaten food, small animals that are trying to, let's say, get acorns or something similar. And it targets those animals or birds. And, well, essentially it's a free-for-all because they're so busy trying to eat that they don't pay enough attention for the hawk, and the hawk comes down and, while it has its dinner. why we mention the role of traffic lights is that the vehicle stopping at the red traffic light is what provides the opportunity for the bird to strike, because it blocks the view of other birds that don't see it coming until it's too late to stop it. And it also demonstrates that the hawk has to have the ability to not just understand what the red traffic light means, but to plan accordingly. The research is, we won't say necessarily questionable, but certainly not something that can be extrapolated out to other hawks. And the reason for this is very straightforward. It's based on a very small sampling of the hawk's behavior, but it is very specific to those circumstances. If the situation, for example, being a weekend when there are much fewer cars and various other things, or when you can attribute it to specific prompts, let's call it, such as the pedestrian walk indicator, the sound, are the things that are linked directly to it, it's more likely that this hawk in particular is behaving like that. But it's also, again, not something that can be extrapolated out to anything else. In older news now, but somewhat entertaining at least, we have a tortoise that has been found guilty of setting a house on fire for Christmas. Now, a lot of people will have different views on how to celebrate Christmas. A bonfire is one. A bonfire that gets rid of your house entirely, most people aren't going to go with that. But this is where the British tortoise, that's about 45 years old, and from Essex in the UK, knocked over a heating lamp, causing, well, the problem in question, the house burning down. A 45-year-old single turtle on Christmas was either going to do this, burn the house down, or commit suicide. It's one or the other around Christmas. It's somewhat more impressive that the tortoise literally survived being inside not only the room, but the house itself when it was set afire, because typically speaking, most people don't survive that. A tortoise's hard shell provides no protection to suffocation due to a lack of oxygen in the air. In other news from the UK, although this time very much current, we have a warning regarding the size of strawberries and the fact that they're going to be quite difficult to eat, at least in the conventional sense. It's the largest, not just yield in terms of the volume of strawberries that are available, but the physical size of individual strawberries for about 19 years. The concern is very simple. The strawberries are anywhere up to 20% larger than they would otherwise typically be. This means you're going to get, say, 50-gram strawberries, and considering the size of an average strawberry that's, say, 25 to 30 grams, this is a lot more, and because of this, you're going to not be able to eat them. But it doesn't appear to be affecting their shape or their flavor. It has slightly altered how much sugar is in it, but not enough to be of a concern. The reason for this is that the strawberries have had better conditions to grow. It's largely been the fact that the days have been warmer, the nights have been cooler, and this has been a better environment for them to grow. And mostly we're focusing here on the cell, and therefore bigger cells, bigger strawberries. In other agricultural news, we have research that looks at the role of the use of pesticides and how this will alter the soil. What the researchers were looking at in particular is the effect that pesticide application had on both fungal species and microbial species. In general terms, what they found is that the use of pesticides didn't really have any effect on the bacterial species, but it did have an effect on the fungal species. This is important because the researchers now looking at the fungal side of things and the bacterial side of things had different results that were rather important. In terms of bacteria, reducing bacterial populations led to lower litter decomposition, so say leaves, the carbon usage from the soil substrate, and the phosphatase activity. Collectively, these things lead to a drastic loss or reduction in plant growth. The fact that pesticides don't have an effect on this is important because it does undermine one of the major arguments regarding use of pesticides on farms. So if you want to take away the very short version, pesticides reduce the fungal population for a farm and make bacteria that much more important. Of course, you can mitigate this to some extent by, say, seeding or otherwise planting out fungal colonies in a field before doing other things. In other food-related news, a claim that only one country in the world, if it was isolated from every other country in the world, could be self-sufficient when it comes to food. Now, Guyana is an interesting place for all sorts of reasons, let alone its history. It's one of the world's few rocket launch sites. But apparently you can add to that list of interesting things the fact that if it had to feed all of its citizens without ever bringing anything in from any other country, they'd manage. But no other country in the world can. This, of course, is not necessarily a good or bad thing. The self-sufficiency is nice, but it's not necessary, not with the way global trade works now. But if, for example, you were to find yourself in a situation like Britain in the 1939 to 1944 period, let's say Germany in World War I, or various other countries, for example Taiwan, if West Taiwan ever decided to siege them, you would have trouble getting food, at least enough food. The researchers looked at 7 groups: fruits, vegetables, dairy, fish, meat, plant-based protein, and starchy staples. The first of these are fairly obvious, but plant-based protein are things like legumes, beans, and similar. The starchy staples are rice, wheat, potatoes, and so on. The research found that about 2/3 of countries across the world are producing more meat and dairy than they need, which of course leads to export to other countries, and other countries themselves are producing, well, excess other things. Now, for example, you have your fruits, vegetables, your fish, and so on. So it makes sense that you would have a certain amount of global trade in that respect. There are a couple of other countries that have a better chance of surviving it if this ever happened, for example China and Vietnam, because they were able to be self-sufficient in 6 of the 7 food groups. Overall, if you look at just the nature of the research, 1 in 7 countries would be able to make do with 5 of the 7 categories. So that's a really small number, and it means that most countries in the world couldn't meet most of their basic needs if they ever became semi-isolated, or completely isolated, which kinda makes sense. There are a lot of countries in the world that just aren't hospitable to food production. For example, if you're in the Arabian Peninsula, all that desert isn't going to really be good for growing food. For some reason, plants don't like sand. They're kind of like Anakin in that respect, except unlike Anakin, well, no actually, much like Anakin, a lack of these things can lead to the death of younglings. In research that doesn't actually make a lot of sense to us, the Chinese scientists claim to have created a contact lens that allows you to see light that isn't otherwise visible to the human eye. Which, given it's not visible to the human eye, we would think that even if you put a contact lens on, it's still not visible. But let's assume that they've done something weird here. The range of light that the human can see is between 4 and 700 nanometers. It's your red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Outside of this, for example, ultraviolet or infrared, you just don't get to see. The researchers were able to make this happen by having the contact lens embedded with essentially tiny little obstacles, nanoparticles, that make the infrared wavelength into something that's visible to us, exactly the same way night vision goggles work, except these aren't powered, and theoretically, if they were used, for example in combat, it could make it much easier for soldiers to function, as you would have all of the necessary compensation in your eye. For example, if you need to see something further away, you can still see it, so you obviously don't need to worry about that. And unlike, say, night vision goggles, where if you are exposed to a sudden flash of light, yes, you'll be blinded, but your eye won't be destroyed. Other than the very obvious and very unfortunate military applications, the researchers do claim this has, militant uses. They're talking here about theoretically extending the research out to allow for the vision of colorblind people to be restored to otherwise typical vision levels, allowing you to see colors you otherwise can't see. And of course it would theoretically allow West Taiwan to occupy Taiwan that much more easily. In technology-related news, we have to ask, if you were to die today, what about all the stuff you've put online? Your Facebook profile, your X profile, your Mastodon, your research collection that's incredibly large in data size on your computer. What happens to all of this, and how do you deal with it? The conversations provided arguably a good breakdown of what happens, but it does raise those concerns. It's considered a digital asset, that is to say something you, strictly speaking, own, but it also has no tangible product, therefore it's all data. Sure, there's somewhere with ones and zeros put onto a drive, but that itself doesn't have any value. it's the information that is valuable. That is assuming, of course, we're not talking about your OnlyFans account, in which case, depending on whether or not you're a creator or a subscriber, there'll be different issues here. The advice from the conversation is something that a lot of people already know to do, which is have someone know what to do with your computer after you die. For example, ensuring someone knows to delete your internet browser history. And of course you can make this much easier by having what is for all intents and purposes a digital will. That is a last will and testament saying, if and no doubt when you die, this is what I want done with, say, your email account, your Facebook account, your whatever account it happens to be. Shifting now to research news, it's a interesting examination of academia, and arguably why it is that academia is kind of broken in ways. This is an older article, mind you, it's from 2 years ago, but it's relatively consistent with what we've described recently with the student experiences at a postgraduate level. It's about an individual who tried to report that their supervisor was doing some really dodgy stuff. By dodgy, we mean they were committing fraud. We won't mince words on this one. They were fabricating data in order to publish results that really should never have seen the light of day. And so, they naturally took this to someone more senior. And seniors within the university went, yeah, we know what you're talking about, but we see nothing wrong with this. In fact, things got much worse. Not only did their supervisor, but people above them see nothing wrong with it, when they included it in their thesis in an effort to put out their thoughts, at least in publication of sorts, their supervisor told them, no, don't do that, and couldn't at all answer any of their actual questions about what was the problem with what they had presented in terms of, say, the methodological critiques, the result critiques, and other similar academic and methodological only problems with it. And this got worse as a defense panel, that is when you present your thesis and say, these are my findings, this is my work, here it is, now tell me what you think is wrong with it. The panel had two members basically say, this is not okay, you should never have included any kind of criticism of other research in your thesis, which is stupid, because that's not what a thesis is. If there's problems with other research and your research addresses those problems, you include the fact that you are directly challenging something that exists out there. You don't just go, yeah, I know it's there, but ignore it. You can be as inflammatory and as, let's say, brusque as you want to be, but so long as you are actually addressing it in a proper scientific manner, it's fine. It's not necessarily polite, or let's say, nice, but it is something that needs to be done. And this eventually led to the individual having to change their thesis and remove these major elements because their panel refused to sign off at it until they did so. This does not look good for those particular committee members. When the third member said it was brave and bold to challenge the research, and attempts to replicate the study using the dataset from the researchers, 5 different datasets for 5 different publications, found that you couldn't actually do what they claimed to have done based on the research they claimed to have done with the methods they claimed to have done. We say claimed because, well, you don't get the results if you do what they say they did with the data they say they did it with. This is the definitive definition of fraud in terms of data analysis. The ending of this is not particularly exciting or useful. Basically, nobody ever saw any results, and the individual who tried to do the right thing ended up leaving academia because it's crap. In related news, which really does show that this problem has not gone away, we have formulaic research that's using inappropriate study designs and producing false discoveries. Basically meaning that the exact problems that were raised way back when, in 2023, are still there today in 2025, and were probably there all the way back in 2015 and 2013. This problem has not gone away. And that's an issue here. Now, some of this is not necessarily bad news, as to some extent a lot of this research could be useful if it was well done. But when you have the combination of essentially lazy research, a willingness to commit fraud, and the availability of, well, large data sets to do this with, researchers basically start churning out papers like crazy for no reason other than they need to publish. And this brings us to the problem. When you have the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey able to be interrogated by AI very quickly and very easily, researchers can begin producing publications that really shouldn't be published the way they are, because the methods simply aren't any good. The methods aren't always bad, but they are disproportionately bad, and the effect of this does get worse over time. When you look at this, the problem is that it begins to taint the entire pool of peer-reviewed published research, rather than just being the occasional bad apple. It spreads like cancer, which then affects other research, because other research relies on this publication to go, okay, that's where things are now, I need to then build on top of it. But the foundations that you're building on are rotten. And this is exactly the same issue as with the previous news item. The difference being that, unlike the previous news item, there is no solution to this until we can find a way to address the use of AI-assisted publications in academia. In other academia-related news, Trump's administration has possibly brought about an end to Harvard's ability to enroll international students. A lot of people are probably going to think, great, there are no more students doing the degree I want to get into, therefore I have a chance. The problem isn't that so much. To be clear, that will be affected. But the issue is going to be rather more significant at a higher level, that is, say, master's and PhD levels, where a lot of students go abroad to do their degree. Those students now are going to have their visa revoked, and suddenly there are a whole lot of labs at universities that are going to be in trouble. The problem with this is that if they're in the middle of something, generally speaking they should be, suddenly they have no one to take over this project, which means a lot of laboratories are going to be crippled by this. In terms of Harvard, about a quarter of its students are international, and as such, about a quarter of all labs, assuming an equal distribution across all degree levels, will now have been crippled by Trump's decision, and that's not awesome. We're not saying that theoretically there aren't options to try and extend timeframes and do everything else, but given that Harvard has basically said to its international students, look, just stay home for now until we figure out what's going on, it's not good. Going much further abroad now, we have Martian atmosphere, that is Mars, showing signs of sputtering, and this might sound weird. Probably not a term you're familiar with other than the sputtering of, say, a boiling pot or similar. But what we're talking about here is the way that, various parts of the atmosphere can be lost in the early solar system. Basically, the nature of the, let's say, early Mars development had energy from the sun hitting it and causing the gases that make up the Martian atmosphere to be driven off. The same way, say, the bubbles on a stove, when they pop, let a little bit of moisture out and the water then escapes as vapor on top of the water itself. The typical effect of this is very tiny, minuscule arguably, but with the lack of a Martian magnetic field, this is a problem because it leads to bigger losses, notably bigger losses. Now, we've used the example here of, say, boiling water in a pot, but in terms of, say, an atmosphere like Mars, we're talking about gases, argon for example, and they found that if the part of the Martian atmosphere that we're talking about is facing away from the sun, and therefore protected from solar winds and radiation, it has a much lower loss of argon. And the same is true the further down into the atmosphere you go, so closer to the Martian surface, the more protected it is. Whereas on the other side, it was exactly the opposite. And during periods of the sun being far more active, and we mean ancient history here, it would have explained some of the loss of the Martian atmosphere to the universe, as the sun basically drove it off. Last, we have what would probably get some of the more excitable individuals out there excited. It's a discovery of a mystery object 15,000 light years away, so we're not going to see it anytime soon, although we can at least get some visual indication of what it is. What's useful about it is that, well, it's there. We know what it is to some extent. It's something we can see very, very vaguely using radio telescopes. What makes this mysterious object interesting is that it seems to be emitting reasonably regular, lengthy pulses that are picked up by the same radio telescopes. And Based on the research, the radio wave bursts are about 5 minutes long and occur roughly every 22 minutes. This would indicate something not just regular, but very much not necessarily deliberate, but definitely consistent. And what makes this useful is theoretically it's either going to be a very large astronomical body, for example, giant stars that are being intermittently occluded by something, or possibly, and this is where people get excited by, the idea of something being able to communicate, which are less likely but theoretically possible. More so when you consider that prior to November 2023, this activity wasn't there, or at least it wasn't detected, meaning it's a very recent phenomena. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.